Thank you for coming. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Jim Mellon. Thank you very much.
Thanks to John Shimon. Thank you, Courtney Heading, for inviting me along today. I've already dropped my papers. We live in exciting times. The Isle of Man has always embraced new opportunities, and while it may be a little bit behind the curve on biosciences, it's certainly catching up. And as part of my talk today, I'm going to talk about how I think the Isle of Man could benefit from biosciences, and indeed how biosciences could benefit from the Isle of Man. It's not a prescription, it's my own personal thoughts. And indeed, in the next 2 or 3 months, we'll be locating 2 bioscience companies here in the Isle of Man. So we're doing our own bit to contribute to the development of a cluster here, which, as Lucius was saying earlier, has helped Oxford so much, and hopefully will also help the Isle of Man. I'm not wearing a white coat. I've never worn a white coat. I'm not a scientist. And so when I decided to get into this area, I had to do some homework, starting with Biosciences for Dummies, which is the range of books I always turn to on any subject I know nothing about. And subsequently, I have written a book, which is at the back there, and anyone who wants one is welcome to take a copy. They are free. The unsigned copies are worth a lot more than the signed copies. So please do take one. It's about 1.5 years old, but I hope some of it will still be relevant and useful to you. And if any of you want copies of my slides, my colleague James Griffiths, who's sitting there, looking highly embarrassed at being pointed at, is available to take your details, and the slides will be sent to you. And I'm also on Twitter, which I use quite a lot now, at JIMMHK. So advert over, and on to the talk. I'm going to talk today about biopharma as a source of huge potential profit and huge benefit to mankind, as Minister Shimon just said. And my talk is going to be divided into the acceleration of science, which is what got me very interested in the area in the first place, the 3 giant driving factors that make it so opportune and so exciting at the moment, where unmet medical needs are being addressed, the therapeutic areas of interest that we, as investors at Burnbrae Limited and me personally, are looking at, and how the Isle of Man, as I said earlier, can benefit from biopharma, and biopharma can benefit from the Isle of Man, this very dynamic nation which has come from being, as some of you know, a poor relative to the United Kingdom to being one that has far surpassed the UK in terms of per capita GDP. And everyone who lives here can be incredibly proud of its achievements in that respect. We are entering a golden age in biopharma. It's an age that is occurring because of an acceleration that most of us can't see in scientific development with our naked eye. You have to look at the sort of hockey curve effect to understand what's going on. And one man who did that is a man called Ray Kurzweil, who wrote a book called The Singularity is Near. The singularity is the point at which artificial and human intelligence merge, and artificial intelligence overtakes human intelligence. Now, Ray Kurzweil is a bit of a cult figure. He's like the Reverend Moon without the mass weddings. He's a futurist who has his own university in California, and he posits that in 2045 the singularity will take place. I don't know how he knows it's going to be in 2045. It's a very provocative book. It's full of statistics and lots of talk about Moore's law and all that sort of stuff, but it got me really thinking about this new, it's not a new industry, it's an industry that dates back to the 1970s really, but an industry that's benefiting from the accelerating returns of scientific research and has direct application to every one of us in this room and to all our relatives outside of this room. So I read The Singularity is Near, and I thought, right, I've been in mining for the last 10 years, and some of our mining companies are still domiciled here in the Isle of Man. Mining is characterized by a very high rate of failure, high capital intensity, lots of government intervention. Of course, that doesn't happen here in the Isle of Man. And long lead times, exactly the same as biotech. Very high rate of failure, lots of government intervention, particularly in regulation, quite rightly. Very capital intensive. It costs about $1 billion to bring a new drug to market on average, including all the failures. And very long lead times. On average, it takes 8 years from a compound being discovered to it coming to market, in which case it's only got about 12 years left of patent life. So there's lots of similarities between mining and biotech. That wasn't the reason I got into it. It was partly because of this, but also partly because I bought a flat in San Francisco, which is the epicenter. I know that's the wrong word to use in the context of San Francisco, but the epicenter of world science. And if you think about all the companies that we read about today, Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., Intel, they all come from San Francisco or nearby San Francisco. And San Francisco struck me as the place to base myself for my research and also my introduction to this fascinating and wonderful business. And my neighbor down the hall was a guy called David Hung, who has become a very good friend of mine. And David Hung had set up a company called Medivation, which was listed on the NASDAQ exchange in the United States. David had 2 drugs in development. And his story is one that I think encapsulates the whole ups and downs, dangers, rigors, capital investment, and all that sort of stuff of bioscience in one particular package. And I'm going to very briefly talk about David. So David is a very, very persuasive interlocutor on bioscience. As many of you I know in this room are, the people who are coming to talk with enthusiasm about their companies. For every company that comes to me, I wish I had enough money to invest in them, because there are so many enthusiasts out there with great ideas. But David had 2 great ideas. One was a drug for Alzheimer's, and I know that we're going to hear from Baroness Greenfield later on about Alzheimer's. It was a reformulated antihistamine from Russia. It was in partnership with Pfizer, and there was a lot of excitement about this drug. It was going to reduce the onset of Alzheimer's. It was going to slow down the pace of the disease. It had done quite well in phase 1 and 2 trials, and it was in phase 3 trial, and Pfizer had put $250 million into this drug. I took the money that I had to invest in biosciences and I put it into Medivation shares, and needless to say, after a couple of months, I lost 50% of my money because the drug didn't work, as so many drugs don't work. Luckily, David had a second drug, which is why I'm always looking for companies with double shots on goal. And his second drug was called MDV3100, today known as Xtandi. And Xtandi was in partnership with a Japanese company called Astellas, a big Japanese pharmaceutical company. And the reason I talk about these partnerships is that this is the new way in which drugs are being developed. The big drug companies, the ones that can distribute and manufacture, are going into partnership with the innovators. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on in my talk. But anyway, Xtandi passed its phase 3 trials, and today Xtandi is the world's probably most promising drug for prostate cancer, and Medivation's market capitalization has gone to over $6 billion US. Needless to say, David Hung has moved out of the apartment block in which I live into a much grander apartment block and a much bigger flat. He's bought a Stradivarius violin. He's a real Renaissance man. He's bought a restaurant. And when we were all in Edinburgh for the Edinburgh Festival this year, he decided to buy the biggest house in Edinburgh that was for sale as well. So his fortunes went up, they went down, they went up again, and he has, with his 2 shots on goal, achieved something quite remarkable. He is the encapsulation, and his story is the encapsulation of this whole industry. Lots of failures, but the few successes can compensate for almost any number of failures. And what we're trying to do as investors is to narrow down the range of failure and increase the number of successes, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit in this presentation today. Now, the 2 really important things that have occurred, and I know that those of you who are scientists are well familiar with this in the last 60 years, is first of all the unveiling of the structure of DNA, the discovery of the double helix, and then secondly the sequencing of the human genome, which occurred about 50 years after the unveiling of the structure of DNA and cost between $5 and $10 billion to do, and took many years to accomplish, and many countries and many scientists to accomplish. Now today, this little box here, which is known as the lunchbox sequencer, and I saw it in San Francisco quite recently, in fact in the last month or so, made by a company called Genome, can sequence a whole human genome in approximately 2 hours for a cost of between $600 and $700 US, fully done. It uploads the information into the cloud matches against 100,000 known diseases and comes back and tells you what you are likely to get or what disease you've already got, and does sort of stuff that was unthinkable just 5 or 10 years ago. And sooner or later, one of these boxes, or an even smaller box, will be in every doctor's surgery, lots of clinical settings, and we will all be having our genome sequenced fully or in part as part of normal medical practice. Now, I don't like the sequencing business. In fact, I had an investment in a company called Complete Genomics, which was a failure because it's a commodity business. There's a huge company in Oxford called Oxford Nanopore, huge in terms of its market value and the amount of money it's raised. But I don't see this as a business of great opportunity because it's one in which there's a lot of competition. The technology is evolving so quickly that it's very hard to establish a lead. There is a big company called Illumina in the business, and it's done reasonably well, but this is not where I see the biggest opportunity for either the Isle of Man or myself as an investor. But what this is showing is that this was the Illumina machine that was still is in wide use until very recently, and this is the new way, and no doubt there'll be something even smaller. And what the sequencing of the human genome does is to unveil the map of our bodies, and as we get more intelligent, as we move towards this point of singularity, that map reading is going to become much, much more important to doctors, to researchers, to scientists, and so forth. And we will be able to address diseases in a much more personalized way than in the past, where the blockbuster drugs have been dished out to masses of the population willy-nilly, rather than personalized to the individual's own genome. And this is the real revolution that's going on at the moment. It's not one in which necessarily we're going to make money, but it's very important to understand that this is one of the key drivers of the pharma industry in the next 10 or 20 years. Now, another very big driver that's occurring is that we are all getting older. The world's population is aging very rapidly. One of the key factors in that aging structure, by the way, is the one-child policy in China. Don't underestimate that. That is resulting in a very big cohort of old people coming into existence, moving into old age in China, as well as around the world. Fertility rates have plummeted most developed countries below the replacement rate, of which is 2.1 children per woman. And we're seeing, in a country like Japan, the possibility of a 30% fall in the population over the next 30 years. This has very big effects, both cumulative in terms of cost, in terms of the dependency ratios, all those things that we're all familiar with. And all of us, as we get older, don't want to be in the elderly category, i.e. the old people tottering around who are finding it very hard to deal with the burdens of old age. We want to be in the welderly category. And a lot of medicine in the next 10 or 20 years will be about bringing people out of elderliness into welderliness. You can see here the increase in the population of 65-year-olds. And of course, once you're over 65, you spend per capita 4 times more on healthcare than a comparable 40-year-old does. So the whole healthcare business is going to grow enormously as a result of this increase in the number of old people around the world. Secondly, of course, we have the lifestyle disease epidemic. Notwithstanding the fact that Professor Richard Dole in the 1960s identified a link between smoking and lung cancer, and that smokers on average will live 14 years less than non-smokers, people continue to smoke. And I think in the next 10 or 20 years we'll look back and say, how was it that we allowed this tobacco industry to continue knowing that it was causing this huge disease burden and this cruel early death burden on the population of those people who smoke? Nonetheless, in the Western world, lung cancer is still a very big disease because we're seeing the effects of people who smoked in the 1960s and the 1970s. And of course, in Asia and the developing world, it's going to be an enormous disease because of the high incidence of smoking and the longer life expectancy of people in the emerging world as they get richer. As they get richer, of course, they also get the tummies that we, or people in the West, tend to get from eating all the wrong foods. They get the cardio disease, they get the comorbidities of diabetes, and of course, Alzheimer's is now linked to diabetes as well, and Alzheimer's is going to be a huge burden of care as people get older. So the lifestyle disease epidemic is absolutely enormous. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, chronic kidney disease, you name it, these are huge diseases which are, in a large part, unmet medically, and in the next 10 or 20 years will be met medically, in my opinion. The emerging middle class in the developing world is a very important driver for us in the biopharma industry. By 2020, there will be 2 billion people in the middle classes in Asia, which way dwarfs the size of the middle classes in the United States or here in Europe on a combined basis. And of course, these people are not just living longer, they're also now more capable of buying the drugs that our companies will be selling them and the medical interventions that our companies will be selling them, and indeed they will want those drugs and those medical interventions. At the moment in the United States, it's by far the highest amount of dollar spend per capita in drugs. It's about $900 per person per annum. And in the United States, as you know, about $9,000 per annum per person, 18% of GDP is spent on healthcare. It's a very, very large burden. Now, in China, the figure is just above $100. In India, it's somewhere around $30. So the potential for the middle classes to increase their consumption of drugs, prescribed drugs, I hasten to add, in these developing markets is going to be a huge driver for the whole biopharma industry in the next 10 or 20 years. Now, why are drugs important in the context of healthcare? Because they displace, or they can displace, the movement of people from their homes into hospitals or nursing facilities and so forth. Drugs are really important in moving people out of the most expensive hotel you're ever going to stay in, which is a hospital bed, and keeping you out of there and keeping you healthy. A good example is mental health. In the 1950s in the United States, there were 5 million people in mental institutions in the United States. With the development of the earliest classes and subsequently the SSRI classes of antidepressants and antipsychotics, there are now only 500,000 people in mental institutions in the United States. So drugs can have a massive effect of moving people out of high care, high cost hospitals and nursing homes into their own homes and maintaining them at a better standard of living. So I think that although there is I was talking to a very well-versed gentleman in the drug business, Mr. Lauren Johnson, last night, about the pressures on drug pricing around the world. And although there is going to be pressure on drug prices, particularly at the upper end in the so-called orphan diseases, I think that fundamentally the United States recognize, the US authorities recognize that drugs are a good displacement factor, and that US, in order to maintain its innovation, will have to maintain relatively high drug pricing relative to the rest of the world. And the US, of course, is where most of the key industries in this area are. Now, in the last few years, we've had some dramatic improvements in health that may not be familiar to everyone in this room. We've had HIV is not conquered, but HIV is livable with. And most people with HIV will now live as long as the rest of us in this room. And Gilead has come out with its Atripla pill recently, which is a once-a-day therapy, whereas as recently as 15 years ago, you had to take 21 pills a day, and you had to take them at particular times. Now you take 1 pill a day. And so it's gone from fatal to manageable. HCV, hepatitis C, is now curable for certain genome types, and possibly all genome types, with, again, Gilead's Pharmacet drug, which has just been approved by the FDA in the United States. Now, these drugs are very expensive, and Gilead is a money-making machine, but nonetheless, it has successfully found a way of eradicating 2 massive disease categories. In cancer, we are finding that survival rates are improving in many cancers. There are still some intractable ones, such as pancreatic cancer, lung cancer, and so forth. I'll be talking about them in a second. But medical advance is leading to longevity improvements. And on average, we can all expect our life expectancies to go up by 1 year every decade, which has been the pattern for the last 30 or 40 years. So drugs are making a real difference to life expectancy and to the quality of life and to survival outcomes in key diseases. These are the major drug approvals in the United States in the last few years. One that you'll see here is Tecfidera, which is a multiple sclerosis drug that's just recently come onto the market. They're expecting peak sales of about $7 billion US a year. That sounds like a lot, but that's still relatively small in the context of the huge blockbusters of the 80s and 90s coming out of the major pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer, Merck, and so forth. To give you an example, the biggest selling drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry was Lipitor, which came off patent quite recently. Lipitor was selling 13 to 14 billion US dollars worth of drug a year around the world. It was one of those drugs, a small molecule drug that cost $1 billion to develop and 1 cent to produce every subsequent tablet. Lipitor, when it went generic, went from sales of $14 billion down to current levels of maybe 100 or 200 million because of the genericization of the product overnight. One of the interesting things that's happening with drugs today is that the biological drugs, the ones that are more difficult to manufacture, that are not made with synthetic chemistry, are taking up an increasing part of the total sales of drugs. Now, biologics are much harder to replicate from a generic point of view. So the patent life or the margin protection of those sort of drugs is much more secure than in the small molecule drugs, which were formerly the dominant part of the market. Now, biologic drugs are going to be 60 to 70% of the total drug market in a couple of years. So they are a very important part of the new drug landscape. You can see Medivation, its Xtandi drug, is one of the drugs approved in 2012, and peak sales likely to be $1.5 billion. We've seen new obesity drugs that have come on the market. I talked about Atripla. Cripolis, which is for multiple myeloma, is a very interesting company. It comes out of Onyx, which has recently been acquired. And Regeneron, which is for age-related macular degeneration, is also going to be a very, very large drug. So in all sorts of categories, new, very effective drugs. Eliquis from Bristol Squibb as an anticoagulant, replacing warfarin and so forth, is also going to be a very large drug. So there's a whole raft of new drug approvals coming onto the market, none of which have got the huge blockbuster potential of Lipitor, but which combined represent a very big improvement in disease management. And most of those come out of the United States at the moment. Now, these are the drugs and the key drugs in the FDA pipeline in 2014. I don't propose to go through these. If you want to get the slides, please do ask James later on. In terms of therapeutic areas of interest, the places that we, and these are not necessarily therapeutic areas, these are areas of interest. I talked about biologics, immunotherapy, which is where you train your body's own, or you'll have your body's own immune system trained to attack specific cancer cells, is going to be a very large part of oncology treatment. The oncology market at the moment is $350 billion a year. Drugs such as Herceptin or Avastin will be familiar to you, and they've come on the market in the last 15 or 20 years. But immunotherapy is going to displace many of those drugs, because immunotherapy is going to represent, by some estimates, 60% of the whole oncology market, up from 3%. And companies such as Adaptimmune or Immunocore out of Oxford, not that I necessarily recommend those companies, are leaders in this immunotherapy field, with Bristol Squibb Myers and Roche right at the top. That is going to be a very, very big change in the treatment of cancer in the next 10 or 20 years. You're all familiar with stem cells and regenerative medicine. It's hard to find ways to make money out of stem cells. As part of the research of my book, I went to visit the guy who identified the induced pluripotent human stem cell in the University of Madison, James Thomson. His company, Cellular Dynamics, has recently gone public. But again, I think it's going to be a commodity business. And it's a business in which there is still no real way of identifying the end outcome, i.e. the profitable outcome that we as investors are looking for. Biomarkers and companion diagnostics are also going to be extremely large businesses which go alongside the personalization of medicine that I talked about earlier on. We've also got genetics, the monogenetic defects that are largely responsible for many of the orphan diseases, and there are 7,000 identified orphan diseases in the world, those diseases being those in which there are less than 200,000 patients in the United States. Genetics, at long last, gene therapy is showing some promise, where you can either pre-select out a bad gene, preconception, or in an ambulant adult or even a child, you can change the genes within them. And I'm going to talk very briefly about that later on. Short interference RNA, in which I have an investment of some magnitude in a company in the United States, is exceptionally interesting. Arrowhead Research, based out of the United States. I'm trying to persuade them to open a facility here in the Isle of Man. And of course, we've got sequencing, which I talked about earlier. The diseases of aging, which I know we're going to hear about more today, arthritis, osteoporosis, neurological disorders are going to be massive diseases. As I understand it, there are 40 million people with Alzheimer's in the world at the moment, and that figure is going to rise dramatically. 1 in 2 people over the age of 85 will have some form of dementia, and the number of people over 85 is exploding. Children who are born today have a very good chance of living to over 100 years, and I do believe that the first person to live over 150 is alive today, which is a big billboard you see as you come out of San Francisco airport. And of course, you've got these orphan diseases, which also represent a huge opportunity, and in which, as an example, we have an investment in one based in Oxford, which is in the Oxford cluster for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is a terrible disease affecting 1 in 3,500 boys. They all die by about the age of 25 or 26. They are advocates for their own disease because they grow up knowing that they've got this fatal disease. They're in wheelchairs at the age of 12, though it has no specific racial profile, no geographical profile, and there are 500,000 such boys in the world, and there is nothing for them at the moment, absolutely nothing. So it's exciting to be involved in a company that has just gone into the first dosing of patients with a utrophin upregulator based out of Oxford. So here we are. I mentioned small molecules. I won't belabor that, but the blue ones are the small molecules. That's as recently as 2008. They dominated the landscape in drugs. Today, as you can see, it's the biologic drugs, and that trend will carry on. We have the cancer immunotherapy I talked about earlier. I think that the potential for that is much bigger than $35 billion. I think that's a typo there. The potential is $350 billion within the decade. And these are the immunotherapy drugs that are looking very promising. Yervoy's already on the market. More and more of them are going to come on the market. And the effect of that will be, and I predict this, that in the next 10 years you will see something for pancreatic cancer, which is the world's fastest growing cancer, and something for lung cancer that will be very effective. And indeed, we have an investment in a company called Gensignia, which has got a test that shows up lung cancer 2 years before a CT spiral scan does. And I don't know if you know this, but if you do have lung cancer in the early stages, you can surgically deal with it and you'll have a 90% chance of living 5 years. If you don't surgically deal with it, your chance of living is, in other words, you don't detect it early enough, your chance of living is, for beyond 5 years, is 6%. So it makes a very big difference if you can detect the presence of the cancer early. Stem cells I talked about earlier on. I think it's too early to be investing in this area. I think stem cells represent, at the moment, at the pure scientific end of research, and I would not recommend that stem cells in regenerative medicine are an area for the Isle of Man to look at specifically at the moment. There's plenty of people doing it. There's plenty of money being, in my opinion, poured down the drain in this area. There's only really one company of any significance involved in stem cells, which is Mesoblast, an Australian company with a $2 billion market cap, which is involved in cardiovascular use of stem cells and also for knee regeneration, etc. I think that is an area that is one too far for the Isle of Man at the moment, and I'll talk about my ideas for the Isle of Man in just a second. Biomarkers and companion diagnostics are an area that might be of interest to the Isle of Man, and it's something that I think should be encouraged by the government, is to bring the biomarker and companion diagnostic companies here. In terms of genetics, for the first time ever, we're able to go in to the, as I said, preconception and to take out some of these genes that can cause such misery and disaster for parents, and specifically the orphan diseases, for instance, the lysosomal storage diseases. Now, just to show you the market for these sort of diseases that are orphan, there's a company called Alexion. Alexion is listed in the US. Its market capitalization has gone over $30 billion US. Now, that's bigger than Shire, which is one of the largest UK companies. It's bigger than almost every company in the United Kingdom. And Alexion at the moment, admittedly it's going into 6 or 7 new orphan indications, but Alexion has one drug called Soliris, and Soliris treats a population in the world, total population, of 1,500 people who suffer from something called PNH. Each one of those people who's being treated costs the insurers or whoever's paying for their treatment $500,000 US a year to keep them alive. So I think there, and I was talking to Lauren about this last night, there you've got the potential for big price pressure, where there's just these ridiculously high therapy costs for very small patient populations. But nonetheless, in due course, these diseases will be genetically selected out as a matter of course over the years, and many of the diseases like cystic fibrosis or DMD and so forth will be treated before they appear in the infant that's born to parents with these defects. There's an example, I just reading it, I throw this up, it's nothing to do with the Isle of Man, and I'm not an investor in it, in a company called Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's found a way of going into healthy adults, or not healthy adults, adults who are alive, and doing something called CRISPR, which is a technology for genetic surgery. They actually they go in and they change your genes in situ. And I think it's a very interesting space and one that we're looking at. But again, I think it's too cutting edge at the moment for the Isle of Man, which has got other areas that it can be more usefully focused on. The diseases of aging, I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more about those, but Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, osteoporosis, rheumatoid arthritis, AMD, cataracts, and hypertension. By the way, everyone in this room should be on a, if you're over the age of 40, should be on a mini aspirin every day, and well, actually preferably take it at night time. It's the most effective therapy for reducing your chance of a stroke or a heart attack, and it's very cheap, and it's widely available, and you don't need a prescription. So that's my cutting-edge science lesson for you today. These are the orphan diseases I talked about earlier on. These are the costs of some of the typical orphan diseases. As I mentioned, I think that in due course, these orphan diseases will be selected out. Now, let's just talk about the landscape of the business. In the 80s and 90s, companies like Pfizer, with drugs like Viagra or Lipitor, developed their own drugs in-house with huge research labs. So Pfizer had several thousand scientists working in Sandwich in Kent, as an example. That whole facility has been shut down. And although they still do their own research, a lot of them are buying in innovation and buying in technology, or licensing innovation and licensing technology. The example would be Astellas with Medivation. Almost all the very big new blockbuster drugs are developed outside of Big Pharma and then are marketed by Big Pharma to their huge network, including in the emerging markets. So Big Pharma has become a sort of massive marketing machine for other people's technology or technology that they've bought in.
Jim, I'm just mindful of my time.
Right. I've only got 3 or 4 more minutes. Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Almost there. Yeah. And so Big Pharma is the ultimate buyer of many of these companies. And the companies that I'm thinking of bringing to the Isle of Man, and other investors will be thinking of bringing here, should be thinking about investing here with an idea of the big pharma companies ultimately taking them out or entering into partnerships with them. So, what about the Isle of Man and Biopharma? The Isle of Man has got some pros. It's very business friendly. It's got a government that's highly adaptable, can write the laws that are specific to an industry. It's got a history of being able to attract new industries. The first plane on the Isle of Man aircraft register was my own, that was a few years ago. It was 6 years ago, and now I believe there are 700 planes or something like that on the Isle of Man register, and it's the largest single register of private aircraft in the world. That displays innovation. It displays an understanding of seizing opportunities, not just investing or looking at the status quo. And the same thing will happen with bioscience. The Isle of Man will find a way. However, there are some negatives. Lots of other countries in the world, including in Europe, the UK, Luxembourg, Malta as examples, have worked out that bioscience is the industry of the future. In the UK, there's the patent box. In Malta and in Luxembourg, there are very attractive incentives. There's also university links in Malta and in Luxembourg that are very important. And if you look at San Francisco as an example, one of the key reasons that it was successful is it fused academia, UCSF, Stanford, and Berkeley as examples, with a huge venture capital pool and an attractive place to live. And as a result, they developed this enormous bioscience industry. And in the Isle of Man, we don't have that academic capability as yet. So my recommendation is that the Isle of Man should look to do an alliance with a university in the United States, because doing one in the UK is not going to work. The patent box is a very formidable challenge to the tax advantages that the Isle of Man has vis-a-vis the United Kingdom and elsewhere. So I think that the Isle of Man should be actively seeking an alliance with a US university which is strongly grounded in biosciences. University of Wisconsin is one that I could throw out there as an example. And that could become the European presence for that university, with exchange of students and with the endowment of a chair specific to Isle of Man opportunities, or something along those lines. That's what I would recommend. The Isle of Man, unfortunately, doesn't have sufficient depth in withholding tax agreements to make it attractive for royalty-based companies, such as those based in Ireland, or now indeed in the United Kingdom. But the Isle of Man is perfect for companies that are designed to be sold. So companies like the one or two that I'm going to show in a second, which are built specifically to be sold to larger enterprises, in which the capital gains tax issue is a is a burden, potentially. And so, this is the German newspaper talking about tax havens, of course, as usual. Again, if you want copies of these slides, have a look at them. I realize I'm under the cosh here, but I want to talk about a couple of the companies that are here or that we are thinking of bringing here. We were an investor in Prometic Life Sciences. Our bank did a bit of funding for Prometic, that's Conister Bank here in the Isle of Man. And it's been a very successful business. It's now got a $500 million Canadian market capitalization. It's based out of the airport. That's exactly the kind of high value added manufacturing that the Isle of Man is highly suited to. And I know that Prometic are very happy to be here in the Isle of Man. We've just bought a third of this company, the Diabetic boot company. It's a private medical device company, produces these shoes for diabetics, and we are going to bring it, which has now got an approved product in Europe, about to be approved hopefully in the United States. The diabetes issue is enormous, and diabetic wounds are a big, big problem. This helps to heal the wounds much more effectively than the traditional way, and I think it's exactly the sort of company, high value-added manufacturing, technology-based company that could situate very well here in the Isle of Man. We are just about to sign a deal for a new sexual health product. Well, our most successful investment in the last year has been in a company based in the UK for premature ejaculation called Plethora. And we had our product approved in Europe. Unfortunately, it's too late to base that company in the Isle of Man. However, this one, which is a follow-on, which is for female sexual dysfunction, we are going to relocate, believe it or not, from New York to the Isle of Man. It comes out of the people who invented Viagra, and it's a very, very powerful drug. It's just about to finish its phase 2 and going into phase 3, and we own approximately a third of that company. We're redirecting that company here into the Isle of Man. Again, a company that's designed to be sold to a larger enterprise or to be licensed to a larger enterprise, a company with high IP, but without cutting-edge science, because I don't think the Isle of Man is yet at the point where it can bring in cutting-edge science successfully, because there isn't enough of an academic cluster here to produce the outcomes that you get at Oxford or in San Francisco, as an example. So in summary, biopharma sector has compelling long-term fundamentals, and ones which I know that the Isle of Man is going to grasp and find a way of making a successful cluster. We can't ignore the opportunities. This affects every one of us personally. This isn't like the gambling industry or the financial services industry. This is one that affects us all as human beings and our relatives and so forth. And the dynamics for it are incredible. And I know that the Isle of Man is going to successfully address that. And I urge the ministers and all the powers that be to work out ways of providing suitable incentives. And one of the things that could be done, maybe you've already done it, is to set up an advisory committee of people who are willing to help the Isle of Man to come to the right solution, to add yet another leg to the many legs, not just the 3 that we see on the symbol of the Isle of Man, that make it such a successful place to do business. I'm sorry I run on, but thank you very much for listening.